Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our virtual parlor chat from the Morris-Jumel mansion. Tonight's virtual parlor chat subject is Free Citizens Under British Rule, the Black Loyalist Experience in New York. My name is Catherine Hughes. I'm the executive director of the Morris-Jumel mansion, which is the oldest surviving residence in Manhattan. It was built in 1765. If you haven't had a chance to come visit us in person, please do so. And you can check out our programming on our website, www.morrisjumel.org. So tonight we have a really interesting talk. So we will get right to it. I want to introduce Mary. This is Mary Tsaltas-Ottomanelli. She is an independent scholar working towards her master's degree in archives and public history at NYU. She is also working with the Hendrick Lott House in Marine Park, Brooklyn, assisting with reinterpretation efforts and collection care. Her research focuses on interpreting and writing about the lives of historically underrepresented and excluded people in the 18th century. Earlier this year, she was awarded the Museum Association of New York's Award of Merit for her research and interpretation of Black patriot and loyalist history during the colonial revolutionary era. Her prior experience includes her role as the Special Programs and Engagement Manager at Francis Tavern, Museum, and Archival Assistant at Trinity Wall Street. So her lecture tonight will focus on the Black Loyalist experience leading up to the British evacuation of New York City at the end of the Revolutionary War. During the war, the British encouraged enslaved people to support the Loyalist effort in exchange for the life and liberty denied to them under the Declaration of Independence. As a result, by 1783, thousands of free and self-emancipated people had flooded into New York City, some as soldiers, but the vast majority as civilians. They were now subjects of the crown, and for many, this was the first time that they had freedom and sovereignty. Although Washington and the Continental Army contested their freedom, British officials maintained their promise through various measures. One was a joint British and American commission documenting nearly 3,000 men, women, and children and granting them safe passage from the former North American colonies. They settled in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and England, beginning a new journey toward freedom. I'm really excited to hear all about this from Mary. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Mary. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be speaking at Morris-Jumel, one of my favorite historic houses. So I'm a little biased in the situation.
Well, thank
you. Let me just get my slides up. We can get started. Oh, there we go. Everybody can see everything. It's always good to ask before I start. Fabulous. So I want to start with the approach to Evacuation Day. It is marked on November 25th, 1783, and it's the last as the last British evacuate the last stronghold at the end of the Revolutionary War. It feels appropriate to begin thinking about remembrance and commemoration around this once widely celebrated holiday, as we have about a week to it. I view New York City as the bookends of the war. It tends to get noticed for the events at the very beginning, like the tearing down of the statue of King George III, and then at the end with Evacuation Day. It's easy to overlook the city when looking at the war because of British occupation, but I don't think that you should, and I don't think that you can anymore. I don't think that commemoration should exclude the thousands that did the actual Evacuation Day, at which it is known for. I don't think those people who chose the crown and those who chose a different path to freedom should be excluded from that kind of memorialization. So we're going to start at the beginning with the occupation of New York City. So here you see the British landing at Kips Bay on New York Island, the 15th of September, 1776. As the decisive victory at the Battle of Long Island in August of 1776, the British would occupy New York City for the entire duration of the Revolutionary War and some extra years, as we'll find out. Occupation of the city officially begins after the landing at Kips Bay, when the British naval forces successfully land along the East River and further drive Continental forces to withdraw from Harlem Heights and losing control of the island in its decision. Less than a week later, the Great Fire would tear through the city, destroying nearly a third of the structures. So when you look at British occupation, especially at the beginning, there's three big movements that are happening. Those are the people who are escaping New York City. The city's population significantly fluctuates during this time. Estimates of the population before the revolution hover around 25,000 permanent citizens. And then by September of 1776, that's cut in half. And these are just estimates because nobody was really sitting there with like a counter going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The chaos and mass exodus of patriots offered new opportunities, and enslaved communities began to create networks to escape safely out of the city themselves. Then there are those who stayed in New York City. There are Black Loyalists who cheered and celebrated as the British arrived and remained in New York City during the entire occupation. Because of those massive amounts of movements, I'd say there were probably around 2,000 Black Loyalists who stayed in New York City at the beginning of the war. There is a New Yorker by the name of Abraham Banker, and I found a letter that he wrote to his father, and he states that, "I believe the chief of the Blacks are encouraged by some secret enemies to stay in the city, as they were seen to muster in large companies. During this chaos, they were able to have more freedom than they had before under former kind of British rule. They're in this weird kind of middle zone. They were allowed to meet in groups. They were allowed to go outside. They had flexibility a little bit more than they had previously in the last couple of years, given all of the slave revolts that have happened and all of the slave codes. It was definitely a different kind of New York City for them to experience." And then the third group are the people coming into New York City, and this was by far the largest amount. Most updated statistics estimate that between 80,000 to 100,000 of the enslaved Black population of the entire 13 colonies ran away from their enslavers during the Revolutionary War. Not all of those people came to New York City, but a good large amount ended up, or at least went through New York City at some point in time. It was mostly young male adults. The average age they found was around 25 years old, and enslaved women only account for approximately 6% of the group. They were coming from Southern colonies like Virginia and the Carolinas. Thomas Jefferson declared that Virginia, through the entire 7-year process, lost around 30,000 slaves. So I want to reiterate that that was the entire, if not more, population of New York City at the beginning of the war. This is a very large amount of people who are going through this forced movement. And by 1779, I've estimated that there were probably around 12,000 self-emancipated people entering the city. By the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, the numbers range probably from 3,000 to 5,000. Around 1,000 of those accounted as Black soldiers. They didn't stay in New York City, again, to be clear. If they sought better options and that there was safe voyage out of New York City, they would have taken it. New York City ends up kind of being this like middle ground for, I can leave and go here, or I can stay and come here. And that will get me to my next place and my next part of my journey. So when you think of their contributions, there were many. They are just not documented. In 1780, there were 1,500 Black soldiers within various British regiments. The most common enlistment position was a pioneer, meaning that they were not quite allowed to handle a weapon, and that those duties were mostly labor-based, like building fortifications. Almost every regiment had a Black drummer or fifer, which I always have to say was a very important job. It is not just about entertainment purposes. It relayed battle commands and was very, very important during battle. Many were able to enlist in the Royal Navy from the very beginning of the war. Unlike the Continental Army, the British Army had the most powerful navy in the world, and they were also willing to enlist these experienced sailors who worked on merchant vessels along the coast before the war. Some regiments that were recognizable include the Ethiopian Regiment, which was raised in 1775 by Lord Dunmore. At its largest, it was made up of around 300 formerly enslaved men from the southern colonies. The regiment fought at the Battle of Great Bridge in December of 1775 with their uniforms, as you can see on the left, that are engraved "Liberty to Slaves." And on the right, you can see Don Troiani's updated version of a Ethiopian regiment soldier. They were successful at first, but unfortunately, due to lack of provisions, overall safety, and disease outbreaks, the regiment disbanded in New York City on Staten Island in September of 1776. Many of their surviving members end up enlisting in the Black Brigade of New York, which was a corps attached to the Queen's Rangers. Their leader, Colonel Ty, was one of the most famous scouts on the British side. A former slave from New Jersey, he led the brigade to success throughout the war through their guerrilla warfare tactics against outlying Patriot forces in New York and New Jersey. The brigade was also present at the Battle of Monmouth. Another common job was to act as a guide or intelligence agents for the British. Instructions were sent out to use formerly enslaved men as scouts in their former home territory. They knew it best. The British understood that this was brand new territory, and they just didn't feel like risking it when they could have people who could show them the in and outs, the shortcuts, how to get through all the waterways, and all of that interesting stuff. Black Loyalists were also very vital to keeping the city running. The more Blacks aided the British as civilian workers than they did as military employees. They helped with the city's worker shortage to help maintain the unexpectedly large population of 35,000 people. Many of them were skilled artisans. They were literate. They knew multiple languages, and because of the diverse economy in the colonies. I should have written that better for myself. They rebuilt the city's infrastructure after the fires in 1776 and 1778. They reinforced the military fortifications around the city. They worked as wagoneers. They moved armaments and other provisions from the docks to military warehouses. They were artisans, mechanics, cooks, carpenters, tailors, and blacksmiths. They were trained people who were ready to work. This was by no means fair. There were still a great level of exploitation at the hands of the military. They were sent to work as personal servants for British officers, or they would work in the estates of sequestered Patriot landowners. It is still worth noting that these jobs were likely the first time some of these men had ever collected wages for their labor. It's also important to point out that demand for work was mostly for men rather than women, because domestic work was not as in demand as manual labor was at this time. There's one important proclamation to look out for, and that is the Philipsburg Proclamation. On June 30th, 1779, British General Sir Henry Clinton ordered the Philipsburg Proclamation to declare the freedom to all enslaved persons that cross safely behind British lines. The key to this one is that it doesn't technically require a military obligation like Dunmore's Proclamation of 1775. You just kind of needed to be behind British lines. Taking up an occupation that you see proper is a very open-ended way of saying, if you come here, please just make yourself useful. I don't care what it is, just get behind the line. The proclamation makes a distinction between slaves captured by the British Army from Patriot forces and those who willingly joined the British. It promised full security to those who joined the British rather than any slave that remained with their loyalist enslaver remained enslaved. By 1779, the Continental Army had opened up their enlistment opportunities. And this is where it gets a little bit difficult to understand, and you have to look at the many layers of the concept of freedom. There are so many different ways for you to be free, and so many different ways, even by the British standards, to remain enslaved. So if you had a loyalist enslaver and you ran away, you were still returned. But Henry Clinton kind of stepped in and was like, but just don't punish them. It's okay, just don't punish them. So you were rewarded if you ran away from a Patriot enslaver, but you were kind of returned and stuck in enslavement if you had a loyalist enslaver. It's very difficult. So when you think of how you choose sides and you think of what kind of freedom is best for me, it's very individual. I also want to point out the preliminary articles of peace. They were signed on November 30th, 1782, and they marked this kind of like legal end to the Revolutionary War. There were 9 articles total that established the United States to be free and sovereign and independent. There were other treaty topics like land boundaries, ceasefires, general treaty information. But for But for all but one of those articles, Continental Congress had jurisdiction over. Article 7, which you can see here on your screen, fell to the Continental Army Commander-in-Chief, General George Washington. And I've highlighted the important part about this, because when we start arguing about the legality of who is free and who is not, they will come back to this. And I think it's very important to note that Washington did this. It says, without causing any destruction or carrying any Negroes away or other property of the American inhabitants, withdraw all his armies, garrisons, and fleets from the United States. Take a moment. All right. Now, from that, while a mass loyalist exodus is happening, there's a major problem brewing, and that's the validity of freedom for, oops. There it is. I skipped a slide. While a mass loyalist exodus is happening, there's a major problem brewing, and that is the validity of freedom for the thousands of formerly enslaved people because of Article 7. Patriot enslavers were determined to retrieve their property. This was for them another major economic loss. During the evacuations of Savannah and Charleston, attempts to record information about formerly enslaved people or even withholding them from leaving was attempted. On April 15th, those preliminary articles of peace were approved by Congress, and Carleton orders that a commission to oversee the property begin. So this becomes the first version of a joint American and British commission that oversees embarkments. It oversaw like claims of property leaving New York City to prevent theft, a very vague idea of what this commission was, but they knew that they had to kind of stop things from leaving that they think they belonged to them. Under this review, refugees who had not lived behind British lines for at least 12 months were not issued a special passport and were not authorized to leave. These types of commissions had been attempted in Charleston and Savannah, and then both times ended completely unsuccessful. British and American officials were unwilling to work together in a professional manner, were constantly fighting over who had the final deciding power, and the British, for the most part, had completely ignored the Americans. They were done with evacuation. They were done dealing with this issue. They wanted to go home, and they were just like, get everybody on a boat and let's go home. With the news of these commissions, in addition to the fact that these types of commissions had failed in the past, and that once a former slave left New York City, the chances of returning were very, very slim, enslavers began taking matters into their own hands. Fear breaks out amongst the remaining Black Loyalists who are awaiting their chance to leave the city. This excerpt that you see on your screen is from the Memoirs of the Life of Boston King, a Black preacher. His memoirs were written in 1793 and are one of the few existing Black Loyalist narratives that exist today. It details his early life during the Revolution, his life to escape enslavement twice, and his journeys to both Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone. I implore everyone watching tonight to read this account. It's not a long one, but it is a very detailed one, and it gives you a very good insight as to what life was like in a narrative that is often only found through bits and pieces and weaved together through other firsthand accounts from other people. It is also worth noting that Carleton doesn't tolerate patriot enslavers entering New York City. So when I say that the British are like done with this behavior and they want to go home because it's already taken 4 extra months to evacuate New York City, Carleton is not dealing with any of this. In one popular story, Jacob Daria's slave refused to leave New York City with him after they were doing a delivery. Daria ties this man to his boat and tries to leave the harbor, but was rescued on the Hudson by Hessian soldiers. The man was freed and Daria was taken back to New York City and eventually court-martialed. And this is just one of many firsthand accounts that you can read about going through people's memoirs who were living in New York City at the time. You can see the fear. The number of 2,000 were to be delivered up to their masters. They were people coming in and dragging them out of their beds. So when I say that it's a very traumatic experience, when you think about world events today and the fear that those people must be going through, it's happened before, unfortunately. So by the time the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd, 1783, this was the last remaining British stronghold. Full-scale efforts of evacuation had begun since April. It is estimated around 9,000 British subjects have already left the city. There's somewhere around 20,000 military personnel that need to leave. There's another 20,000 civilians that need to leave. And that includes all of the formerly enslaved citizens whose freedom and citizenship are being questioned at the time. And the number also includes those evacuated from Savannah in July of 1782 and Charleston in January of 1783, who didn't quite leave the colonies because they weren't sure where they were going. So they went to New York City. Chaos. Chaos is everywhere you can possibly think of in the city. You can see it in journals, you can see it in military correspondences and in other letters, and even in the newspapers. So I have just a tiny little sliver of February 1783, and you can see all of the public auctions, the things that are going on for sale. These are just some of the advertisements of hundreds of ships that were leaving, of 100 auctions that we're having, because people just needed to get on the boat. They were selling everything that did not need to come on the boat with them. It is absolutely like the things that I felt like every time I read one of these newspapers, it feels like a buy nothing group in a neighborhood, because there's just so many things that you think, I could use that, that's for sale. There's also public auctions happening on the street every day without announcements by the British military, because they have only so many vessels to send the troops back onto. So they need the space. So they're just auctioning off extra supplies. They're auctioning off extra livestock that they don't need. Anything that, I mean, truly bare bones, they're just going for it on the street in the harbor. It must have truly been a wonderful sight to see of how chaotic the city was, because I think we think it's quite chaotic now, but I don't think it rivaled anything that it was in 1783. Between April and July of 1783, approximately 80 vessels can be tracked carrying around 3,000 Black refugees left the city. Keep in mind these numbers, because they're just going to keep getting larger and larger and larger. Most of them are headed for the near British ports of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So he starts this commission, and Carleton thinks, okay, I've got it under control. Everything is fine. He doesn't. He has to meet with Washington on the 6th of May of 1783. He meets in Orangetown, New Jersey, with the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army to discuss Article 7. Washington and Congress were very displeased with the way that the British were handling the retrieval of their property. Congress instructed Washington to arrange a transfer of power to retrieve their property rather than have it overseen by the British, meaning that they were going to go in, have ultimate deciding power as to what was theirs, how they were going to decide it. They had final choice of everything that was going to happen, and that the British just needed to like mind their business as all of this was happening. Going into this meeting, Carleton viewed himself as a very staunch defender of the British policy. His interpretation of Article 7 was that any formerly enslaved person who was behind the British lines for November 30th, which was when the agreement was approved, they were free and they were not American property. He just saw it as like, this was the day you needed to get behind the lines by this day. If you did, you were fine. Washington, however, interpreted this in a very straightforward way. All slaves who at any time ever been owned by any American was still property and needed to be remaining in the colonies and could not leave. It doesn't go well. The two men go back and forth. There's a few accounts of their meeting. They write back and forth. Carleton was supposed to come back the next day for a follow-up dinner, and he just kind of went, well, I'm sick and I'm not coming. You know, to be a fly on the wall in that meeting. Carleton would later write to him, I had no right to deprive them of that liberty, meaning their freedom to leave, because he saw them as British subjects of the crown. By May, Carleton stated to Washington that around 6,000 Black Loyalists had already evacuated New York City since 1782. I'm sure Washington, as an enslaver himself, did his best to hide that temper that you barely read about in the history books that you knew was there during this meeting. Carleton also knows granting their freedom is a very good strategic move from a military aspect. Remember, he's evacuating tens of thousands of people over months long time out of one port city. He doesn't have this time to handle the legality and the due process and technicalities that are necessary to redo all of this stuff. If these formerly enslaved people were still considered American property and they needed to be returned, that is a whole nother thing that's going to delay their evacuation even longer. This would slow down everything that was going on, because new procedures and checks with new commissions would have to be created and accounted for, and they have to find the thousands of people who had left and kind of double check them. Well, how do you do this and how do you do that? It was just too much. They would have to travel on government ships because they're technically stolen property, right? They would have to come back, and there's not enough British vessels to carry people whose citizenship is not being questioned at the time. He doesn't want to deal with any of this. He just goes, if they're free, they can travel on any boat that they can. Just keep getting them out of the harbor as we're kind of settling this dispute with everything that's going on. So what's the decision? The men agreed to have a third commission because the third time is the charm. There were 2 other commissions that were attempted to do something like this for both evacuations at Savannah and Charleston. They didn't work. So we're going to try a third one now and hope that it works because they're going to try to do something new. So that is called the compilation of the Book of Negroes. The announcement on your screen notifies the city that the Joint British and American Commission would meet at 54 Pearl Street or at any other official government building. Known today as the compilation of the Book of Negroes, the book holds the name of 1,336 men, 914 women, and 750 children. This is just an extension of the commission that they had tried to do in April. The difference is they have a set location, essentially, where their original commission would be at the docks, at the port, checking registers for ships that were going out, looking at property ledgers or anything that was going on that looked suspicious. Whereas now, if you wanted to leave, you'd have to come meet with this commission and interview with them to get a piece of paper, to get your special passport, to get the approval to leave the city. I have mixed feelings about this. I like that they documented this because this gives us solid numbers that we didn't previously have. I'm also convinced that this was just kind of like a holdover for Carleton, as he secretly gave the approval to evacuate a lot more other people and just kind of please the Americans and distract them a little bit. The role is sometimes referred to as the Birch Trials, named for one of the British representatives, Major General Samuel Birch, commander of the 17th Regiment of the Light Dragoons. Birch examined military enlistment paperwork and conducted interviews about their experiences to make sure that they are who they said that they were. He would then give them what is called a birth certificate, and once approved, seen and left. The birth certificate that is on your right is for Cato Calloway, who immigrated to Nova Scotia after being recorded in the book. And if you look through the roll, you will see that Birch signs off on a lot of people who end up in Nova Scotia because it is closest. So let's take a closer look at the book. This is a page that I pulled out for simplicity. It's very easy to read, I think. What you get, the roll contains the name of the vessel that you're leaving on, so from left to right, where it was going, their name, their age, a notable description about them, and the name of their enslaver. An empty column on the left of the roll was intended for any claimants. Most of them remained empty. The roll was intended to tally the loss of property for later compensation. There's no record of payment ever being made, no payment ever being found. It seems odd that the roll did not list a value amount because everybody was so concerned about getting a reimbursement if their property had left. It's almost as if Carleton never actually intended to follow through with his agreement. I wanted to show you that there were also a decent amount of families with Black Loyalists coming into New York City. There was a lot of family reunification and a lot of family growth, and the idea of this nuclear family that had been so often separated because of enslavement. So you have families who are leaving together. Here you can see Venus leaving with her 2 small children. She was age 25 and she was a stout wench. That is a just common description. You will see it all the time. But it's a very simple way of showing and logging who was there, who was going, and where they were going. This information as a historian is the best thing that I could possibly have. And a closer look at some other people who were in there. So apologies for my terrible Photoshop. The book is this huge giant ledger that probably takes up a couple of feet. It's impossible to put on my computer screen, so I had to kind of chop it up, put it together. These books are multi-volumes. They have full copies that still exist today. There's 2 in the National Archives of the United States and 1 in London as well. On your screen, you have the entries for Boston and Violet King, who you heard about earlier, who wrote his memoirs, and you have Harry Washington. They list the ship that they left on, their destination, and a brief description about each of them. So note about Harry Washington, he ran away from his enslaver, George Washington. Harry is one of several formerly enslaved men that escaped Mount Vernon that is listed in this book. And if you think Washington didn't try to find him, you are wrong. He absolutely inquired about the whereabouts of several of his enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, I should say, in New York City at the time. He tried to send, I think, Tobias Lear in at some point. But you can see their names, their age, stout fellow, fine girl, how they were described. It's truly a remarkable piece of work. Of the estimated 35,000 Loyalist refugees that sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, Black Loyalists numbered around 4,000. First groups of the compilation would land in July of 1783 and settle free Black communities like Birchtown in honor of General Samuel Birch, who oversaw many of their interviews. They would also go on to settle in Digby, St. John's, New Brunswick, and Port Roseway, which would later be renamed Shelburne. Despite British promises of sovereignty and equality under the law, they were met with extreme hardship, racial discrimination, and instances of violence. Fighting amongst those who were already living in these areas, along with the thousands of refugees, both Black and white, were met with struggle and animosity. Arriving before the first cold Canadian winter, many went into the frigid season without proper supplies, food, and shelter, and struggled to stay alive. Struggle continued for the next few years as they adjusted to their new lives. By February of 1792, a fleet of 15 ships carrying 1,196 Black Loyalists sailed for Sierra Leone, including Boston King and Harry Washington. It was not an easy voyage. 67 people died during their travels. After 40 days at sea, they landed in Granville Town and established the Freetown colony. The concept of who a Black Loyalist was is not a monolith. Choosing a side during the war was a deeply personal choice and one that did not come easy for many. If you have a chance to look through this book, which I hope you all do, remember that the concept of freedom, of fighting for that freedom, and what that entailed was vastly different for every single person. I hope you think of these men, women, and children when commemorating Evacuation Day in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was fascinating.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. It is a lot, but I didn't know any of that, not really. It's like you've heard of Evacuation Day, you've heard of a Black Loyalist, but you don't really know the full story. And so you have really uncovered all of this really interesting stuff. And I know you're not the only one, but what what led you down this road?
I think it comes down to this concept of representation in history and where there are holes that need to be filled and who's missing. And when we talk about these big kind of days in American history, who don't we talk about anymore? Because I know when I got interested in this time period and I go to school for it and I do all of these things, it was because I just kept seeing men. And I know that's a very silly thing to say, but I was like, they didn't do all of this. There's no way that they did all of this. So I started looking into revolutionary women, and I started looking about all of these women that it makes me so angry that I didn't learn about in school. And when you learn about Evacuation Day, which is a very tiny forgotten holiday that marks the end of the war in New York City, it's always Washington comes down Broadway. And it was like, well, who did the evacuating? Where did those people go? Where did they come from? Why were they in New York City? What's their story? And you learn about those loyalists, and who, I mean, we were all together before the Revolutionary War, and shouldn't treat them like they were separate entities. I mean, families were fully broken up over this. You can think of Benjamin Franklin and his son and how it destroyed relationships, and thinking, there's just holes that are missing in big things that we don't talk about that I think we're starting to talk about. And the idea of representation and equity in history is so important. And if I can ever so slightly help in this tiny little field that I'm joined with many more prolific scholars, then I'm more than happy to help.
Well, that's great. That's fantastic. Because we definitely need that. And I don't think it's small. I think this is really something affecting all history museums, large and small. It really, there isn't the tiniest little, county history museum still needs to be thinking about where the holes are, whose voice hasn't been heard from, because most of the time people would be shocked that these voices existed. They just don't think that they existed. And so it's really fascinating when you can uncover someone's story that has never been told, never been out there. Like Boston King. That sounds really awesome.
Yeah, Boston King and Harry Washington, and there's a few other have this great they have documentation behind them, which is so rare, because the way that I've been able to trace a lot of these people is through seeing if they have a runaway ad, to see where they came from, where was that ad placed, and kind of finding their trajectory that way. Whereas Boston King has this great, like, well, here's my life on paper, it's published, and it tracks him from his early life, and it goes through the revolution, and it goes through when he enlisted and when he got stuck back in enslavement during the Revolutionary War. He escaped that. He goes to Birchtown, he goes to Sierra Leone, and he has this full life. And it's this way of understanding that experience in an actual tangible way, instead of having to go through memoirs and legal documents and kind of piecing it that way. It's very unique to have somebody using their own voice to be able to tell their story at that time.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we want to open it up to questions from the audience. And so let's see if we have something. This is from Keith. He is saying, excellent presentation on yet another hidden history. Absolutely. Crispus Attucks is hailed as a hero in fighting the Brits, but how about Colonel Tighe, an escaped slave who fought for the British, who freed dozens, if not hundreds, of enslaved people in Monmouth County?
Yeah, Colonel Tighe.
Yeah.
Colonel Tighe comes up. He's also another person that's very heavily documented, which is great. He was the leader of the Black Brigade. He took a hostage situation, if I'm not mistaken. I think you can definitely support me on that. But he definitely comes up in New York City loyalism, because he's able to go in, and he's one of their best scouts, because he uses his knowledge of the land that he was able to live on against the patriot enslavers. He's like a big military figure. I don't know too much about him. I know like the big picture about him, but he's definitely somebody that's on my to-do list for researching for future projects.
Cool. That sounds really interesting. Okay, let's see. Okay. That's just offering the opportunity to share your questions using the Q&A or typing in the chat. So either way is absolutely good for us, and we will read those out.
I have a question, Mary.
Yeah.
For someone who doesn't necessarily have access to the types of documents that you have, but still wants to explore these, lesser told histories or lesser explored histories, what book recommendations would you make? What authors would you recommend people follow? How can the average person who wants to expand their knowledge in this particular field start doing that? And when is your book coming out?
Great questions. So the second one, unclear, soon-ish, maybe. There's definitely more there's definitely more. As to the first one, the thing that I hate most is a paywall. But luckily for us, the copies of the Book of Negroes, both the British version and the American version, are digitized. So you can go find them online. You can peruse them. You can search names. You can get a feel for how big the actual ledger is and zoom your whole page over your screen and follow along. And those are great resources. Gilder Lerman is also really great. They do a great job of taking those documents and having contextual articles around them, and they give you the full PDFs of them as well. Books, I think I have my copy here somewhere. There is an actual published book. I don't have it on me, but I don't remember the author. It is the full book of the Book of Negroes that is published with a little bit of context in it, which is great. It's readable. It's the names, it's seeing where they came from. I think I'm a little more new school when I say that I like to be able to like control F a name instead of kind of going through that way. There is some scholarship on loyalism, Black loyalism, that has been happening in the last couple of decades. Quarles is a great person to start with. He is one of the first kind of Black historians in the United States. I find all of the recent publications cite him. So just go back to the original. If it's not broke, don't fix it, kind of a thing. I don't know what I've been reading. Just I pull up a lot of loyalism books, and I find that the Black experience, not even necessarily in New York City, but as like a whole, is missing from those. And you kind of have to start digging and going through and hoping for the best that you have access to some of those documents.
Have you ever gone up to the Schomburg Center to do research there?
It was on my list during COVID. I haven't had an opportunity to kind of go through the archives and the catalog there yet, but it is on my list of things to do slowly and surely as archives start to open up. And
yeah, I was there on Saturday, and they have the most
everything.
amazing collection of these books from that period. They're just incredible. So, I mean, for anyone in New York, I would highly recommend going and visiting the Schomburg Center on 135th and 6th Avenue, I think. And it's just, they have a really amazing collection. And that's what they're all about. They're really a library.
Yeah, but don't discredit museums. I think Morris-Jumel is doing a great job of reinterpretation, of looking at not just Eliza Jumel, which is a concept. But it's don't discredit your museums. They're working, they have archives that you can go visit. Don't discredit the New York Public Library or the Center for Brooklyn Research. Now I was going to say Brooklyn Historical, but
and the Historical Society, absolutely.
Yeah, NYPL, every time I think that they haven't digitized something, it turns out that they have, and I was wrong, and I'm pleasantly surprised.
Well, I invite anyone to throw us a question. Feel free. These virtual chats are really an opportunity to take a deep dive on a subject. And this is a deep dive maybe for some people, not with the work that you're doing, Mary. I know it's just one section of that research. But it's really exciting what you have been able to talk about tonight. That is something that we can share at the Morris-Jumel House, just in terms of New York history and the Black experience. That's really something that, as you say, we are trying to change that narrative, expand it, broaden it, so that it includes all the people who were living there, not just some of the people. Right. Well, let's see. Some books, The Unknown Revolution by Gary Nash. Oh, these are suggestions.
Yes, thank you, Keith.
Black Patriots and Loyalists by Alan Gilbert. Are these books that you know, Mary?
Gary Nash comes up a lot, so yes. I've drawn a complete blank as somebody who has a stack of like 45 books next to her desk right now of highlights of things that I've been trying to look at. So chalk it up to stage fright.
Well, and when you have so many things, it's like hard to pick one.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Keith. And what are you, so before you leave us, tell us a little bit about what you are working on right now.
A little bit of this and a little bit of that. I'm finishing up another semester at grad school, so I am writing a deep dive on a Saving Places site in New York City. I am finishing up this research, and I'm going to head into another bit of information on the PHILIPSBURG proclamation and looking at that impact that it had, because I've seen multiple sources say that it was a big thing and it was a big draw, and I've seen other sources that were like, nobody really cared about it, it was nothing. But because it exists, I have to make sure that people knew, and it was a big drive, because at the same time the Continental Army had opened up its enlistment regulations, so it was a big competitive piece against Washington.
All right. Well, that's another thing actually that struck me, was just thinking about Washington in a little bit, different terms than we often think about him. And certainly anyone who is interested should read the book about his the formerly enslaved woman, Ona Judge.
Yes.
Yeah, so the title of that book is Never Caught, and it's by Erica Dunbar Armstrong, if anyone is interested. And then the other book that I think, if you're not ready to completely turn your back on Washington, it is Alexis Coe's You Never Forget Your First. She offers a really honest perspective about Washington. And I think one of the most impactful parts of that book for me was the epilogue, where she creates one of the best parts about that book is that she creates these graphic images, and she creates a graphic image of exactly how many families were torn apart when Martha Washington refused to free her enslaved people. Because keep in mind that, Martha had inherited enslaved people from her former husband, Mr. Cutts, and Washington had designated that the people he was enslaving would be freed upon Martha's death. So Alexis Coe really succinctly creates this graphic showing you how many families were torn apart. I look forward to some awesome graphic images in your future book, Mary, which we will sell in the gift shop whenever you get it published.
I feel so honored. Yeah, this is a very kind of brief overview of the ins and outs, and not putting that Black Loyalist experience truly as a monolith. And I remember having discussions with fourth graders of, well, who would you side with, the British or the English? And it was always like, I'd be with Washington, I'd be with the Patriots. And it's like, well, why? Because you knew that they win, and you have that hindsight of where would you have been in 1776 and even to 1783, because people held out to make those choices for such a long time and didn't want to decide, because it was such a scary choice to make. And especially when you have to sign oaths, and they were putting you in prison, and you can be taken at your will at any given time. It was even scarier. And it is, even through Boston King's references of the enslavers coming into New York City when they weren't technically allowed to come in, and stealing people out of their beds as they were searching for their version of what freedom was. Because you say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but that wasn't for everybody in the Declaration of Independence. And you see that with Elizabeth Freeman's case, you see that with the Somerset case in the 1790s, and how this legality starts to break down and break down and break down, and people have to establish that. And even within what I had mentioned earlier of a loyalist enslaver, had somebody run away from them, they were returned. This like double-edged sword of, you can only be free if you were running away, and if you did this, you weren't considered free. And everything was down to the law, and it changed depending on Washington reading Article 7 or Carleton reading Article 7, or even Birch.
Yeah, Yeah, well, the horrible position of being enslaved by the British while others were being freed for being with the British, that is just
It's
such
very,
tenable.
yeah, it's very complex to look at, and you have to do it on a very individualized basis of tracking those people and what happened to them, and reading through loyalist enslavers' memoirs and journals in Nova Scotia that they've left to those historical societies saying, I brought X, Y, and Z with me, and they didn't have a choice. And that African diaspora forced movement again from the Revolutionary War throughout the colonies, and then through the rest of the British colonies, wherever they settled, London, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. Some went to the West Indies, and it was just another forced migration of a group of people who have already suffered so much. And it was just like, we're going to keep doing it again.
Mhm. Yeah, well, and it didn't stop there, so.
No,
Well, we want to thank you very much, Mary, for the presentation you gave us. And we look forward to putting this on our website so that others can see it anytime. And we thank everybody for joining us, and Meg Lynch for being our tech guru tonight, making everything work. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Mary.
thank you.